And that growth of Pentecostalism is clearest in the growth of Christianity in the global South. Pentecostals account for between 80 and 90% of the growth of Protestant movements among traditionally Catholic Latin America. So a lot of Latin Americans are leaving Catholicism for Pentecostalism. In fact, one of the denominations of Pentecostalism, the Assemblies of God, there are more followers of the Assemblies of God in Sao Paulo, Brazil, than in the United States. And so this one region of this one city in Brazil, there are more members of the Assembly of God than there are in the entire United States. No longer, as we've noted already, is Christianity a European or North American religion. And so the largest gains, as we've noted already, are in the global South. And so some commentators on this have referred to it as the browning of Christianity. It is people of color, particularly in the global South, where most Christians are being located. And we saw that in a lot of the demographic changes we looked at on Wednesday and into today, where the largest groups that are growing are in places like Africa, Latin America, and Asia. It's estimated that by 2050, about half of the world's Christians will be found in Africa and Latin America. Only about 1/5, 20% of Christians in 2050 will be non-Hispanic whites. And so what had traditionally been a European religion is changing quite rapidly. Current projections as well indicate that by 2050, about 1 billion of the 3 billion Christians will be charismatic or Pentecostal. That's the direction it appears to be going. Right? And so most Christianity in the global South is becoming Pentecostal. It tends to be orthodox in doctrine and conservative on moral issues. Right? And so the doctrines about Jesus, about the Bible, teachings on homosexuality, abortion, very conservative, very traditional Orthodox Christians. But then there is this openness to the supernatural being involved in the natural life, the miraculous work of the Holy Spirit. And so what we've seen in places like Africa are a sizable growth of indigenous movements of Christianity, which have these very charismatic leaders. And so there's a lot of Christians that are members of these movements where there's this charismatic leader. Within Pentecostalism, a growing subset of that is the so-called prosperity gospel, or the health and wealth gospel, where it's kind of taught that adherence to Christianity and faith in God leads to material blessings in this life. Very popular in the United States, but also very popular in a lot of these places in the global South. So why is Christianity, especially of the conservative Pentecostal type, growing in the global South? Well, when we think about Pentecostalism and fundamentalism and when it developed and how it developed in a time period of modernization, urbanization, right? When you think about 20th century United States, it's developing fundamentalism, Pentecostalism, and it's responding to a lot of those trends that are now taking place in places like Africa, some places in Latin America. And so these movements that have grown up as responses to modernism are now the best situated to kind of develop in the global South. A lot of people feeling kind of estrangement from their families, this disconnection as they move to cities. And Pentecostalism, fundamentalism, providing them the opportunity to connect with other people. These religious communities often provide alternatives for health, welfare, and education that many of these governments are failing to produce. And so places like Africa, where some of the the structures aren't working the way they should, or are unable to deal with some of the crises in welfare and education, there's the church, Pentecostal church, and fundamentalist church. Changes in the social structures that have happened, revolutions and other things that have happened, have decreased the presence of the colonial empires. But these charismatic Christian leaders have often provided a paternalism that people in these countries have learned to accept. Right? And so in these countries, there was such a effect from colonial powers like France and Britain, and other places, that as those fell in the late 20th century into the 21st century, people were wanting or were expecting or were used to that paternalistic charismatic leader, that dictator. Well, not that these charismatic leaders are often always dictators, but that parental approach to Christianity. Pentecostalism, charismatic forms of Christianity provide refuge during times of great social upheaval. Those that are oppressed or marginalized in society find Christianity as a way to overcome that. Essentially, what we see in the 21st century in places in the global south is much like in ancient Rome, where Christians were providing or fulfilling needs, providing relief that wasn't being met by other structures in society. And so there were the Christians in ancient Rome providing for people, helping people, charitably reaching out, because Rome didn't care. Well, in a lot of these places, the dictators, the government, doesn't care. And here are Christians reaching out, some missionaries, some indigenous, reaching out and helping. And so growing in the global south from those types of places. But one of the things in thinking about Protestantism, and specifically thinking about evangelicalism, and so we're seeing growth in the global south. I want to talk a little bit about evangelicalism in the United States, thinking now here at the beginning of the 21st century. And thinking particularly about millennials. One of the things that we've talked about before last Wednesday, when we talked about last Wednesday, was the rise of postmodernism. Postmodernism becoming such a facet of Western ideology that has even creeped into Christianity and evangelicalism. And so a lot of younger evangelicals are being shaped by a postmodern approach to Christianity. And so that's affecting the growth of evangelicalism, because the exclusivity of evangelicalism, the very conservative stance of evangelicalism in the United States, has kind of been undercut by acceptance of the postmodern outlook. Other things happening with evangelicalism, particularly among younger members, is a general disaffection with the church. We certainly don't have the time, but when you think about the number of scandals, the general bad impression of Christianity and Christian churches in the United States since 2000, it's not a surprise that a lot of younger people, the millennial generation, who is reaching adulthood now, it's not a surprise that a lot of people are disaffected with the church because of the continual bombardment in media with negative views, negative examples. And so when we're thinking about the rise of the unaffiliated, some of that is coming from people that would have been within evangelical churches. They're still considering themselves Christian, still have a Christian worldview, but largely disaffected with the church, and really disaffected with the conservative political stance of a lot of evangelicals of the previous generation. Because of how political evangelicalism became in the late 20th into the early 20th century, a lot of millennials have been responding to that and rejecting that, turning to the opposite side, right, the Democratic approach rather than the Republican, or just wanting to see a church that's completely devoid of politics. right? And they don't want to be involved in politics at all. And that shows up in lower voter turnouts among millennials and in general. So there's just this disaffection, a distrust of politics. And that's impacting their connection with evangelicalism. Many of these things are combining to the beginnings of a changing moral stance among evangelicals. While many younger evangelicals still tend to be anti-abortion, it is not as prominent an issue for younger evangelicals as it was for their parents. But when it comes to the issue of homosexuality and same-sex marriage, we are beginning to see quite a bit of difference taking place, with younger evangelicals being more open to the support of it. They might not necessarily support homosexuality or homosexual practice. They might say it's still wrong in the Bible, but they don't believe it should, or they do believe it should be allowed in the United States. And so there's still some, doctrinal issues where there's some similarity, but the moral issues are changing. In fact, when it comes to issues of premarital sex, cohabitation before marriage, more and more evangelicals are not as against that as it was in previous generations. And with sizable numbers of evangelicals having sex outside of marriage, living with a person of the opposite sex out of marriage. And so there's quite a bit of a change in the moral stance of younger evangelicals here in this first part of the 21st century. Ultimately, I don't think Christianity is going to end. But we do see it beginning to take on a different tenor, looking different as far as where the center is. If you would think of a representative Christian in the 19th century, probably the image in the 19th century would have been one of a Protestant white man. In more modern times, probably a woman of color from a place like Africa or Latin America is more representative of Christianity as a whole. And so we're seeing changes in the demographics. We're seeing changes somewhat in the morality. We're seeing changes in which groups are the most dominant. And what remains to be seen is what's going to happen now in the next 15 years, 20 years, as we get to the half of the 21st century. What's Christianity going to look like when we reach the end of the 21st century, although most of us probably won't be there. And so as we finish up this look of church history over the past 4-5 centuries, we see quite a difference between where we are now and where Martin Luther was when he nailed those theses to the door of the Wittenberg Chapel. On Wednesday, we'll take the time to go over the study guide a little bit, talk about some of the essays, help prepare you for that final exam. The final exam is 1 week from today in this room. So hopefully you're working your way through preparing for that as we finish for the